Welcome back, guys, to nunosolutions.com. This is episode 9. Today, we're going to go over the next step, add an employee in our Blazor WebAssembly application that we're building. We had a list of employees that we're fetching from a SQL Server database. It's a Blazor web page with an edit button and a deactivate button and an add employee button. The add employee button doesn't do anything yet, except it just takes you to the add employee page. And the edit button, which is what we did in the last video, you can update the values of any employee that you're editing. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So we can see we're going to change Nuno Pereira to John Doe and hit save. And then you get this little pop-up that tells you that the employee record was saved successfully. And then when you go back into the employee list, you will see that Nuno no longer exists and now it's John Doe. So let's just reset that back real quick. Oh, and real quick, if you go into SQL Server and you re-execute and pull all the records from the employees table, you will see that the Nuno record is now John Doe. But let's reset that back to Nuno Pereira and hit save. It's saved successfully. We're going to go back here, refresh the data from SQL Server, and you can see it's reset back to what we want. And I'm also going to go back into the employee list. I'm also going to edit this second record here, which this should be originally Marco Pereira. So let's do that. There we go. Go back to the employee record. Now we have a Nuno Pereira and a Marco Pereira, and we're ready to go. So the first step is we got to create the add employee form. We have a page already created, but it's empty. Basically, it just has a header that says add employee. So let's go back into Visual Studio. And to make this a little easier is number one, open the add employee Razor page and also open up the edit employee Razor page. And what we're going to do is literally copy all the HTML that's in here, including the inject, because you want to inject the app service. Right click, copy, or just press Control C, it's a shortcut, and then come in here and just paste it at the top. And we're gonna move this add employee down to here, replace the anything that says edit, and move this up to the top here. So now let's save that, and right here the header says edit. We're gonna change that to add, and we're also gonna get rid of this right here. We're outputting the employee ID because there is no employee ID at this moment. In fact, what we can do is move the header outside of the if statement. There's no reason to have it, in this case, inside the if statement because it doesn't change based on employee ID. So we'll leave it this way. Now, if we run it, we're going to error out. This right here is just the modal window, which for now I'm just going to comment out and I'm collapse. And now the other thing we're going to need here, guys, is if you remember, we created the save employee web API, which is in our server project. Here, let me pull it up real quick. This is with the employee web API. This method actually handles both updating and adding. If you don't specify an employee ID when you pass in your employee record parameter over here into your web API, then it'll create an employee instead of updating it. If an employee ID exists, then it'll update the existing record. So we don't have to create another save or another endpoint. We could absolutely split this into 2 endpoints if we wanted to, and probably is recommended. But for the sake of this video, I'm going to keep it this way. So we're going to go back into the add employee page, and we need to create a new save employee button, but we're going to change this. We're going to call this actually create employee, and then I'm going to create a method in here called void create employee. I'm gonna leave it empty for now, and I'm gonna go into the edit employee Razor page, and I'm gonna go down to where we have the save employee. I'm literally gonna copy that code pretty much verbatim, paste it into our create employee method. I just did a Control K D so I can auto format my code. This is complaining because this has to be an async method. And it's also complaining that there's no show modal boolean, so let's copy that as well, because we are still going to show a modal saying that the save was successful. Save that. So at this point, let's just review what we have here. Let's see. So we have first name, last name, age, email, phone, created date, and then we have a create employee button. Let's just run this and see if this loads. Actually, before we do that, there's one thing we have to change, guys. So this page is expecting for the app.employee object to be populated. Otherwise, it's going to show this loading div. So we're going to change this because this page doesn't require an employee parameter, you know what I mean, to be passed in, or an employee object to be passed into the page in order for it to render. In the edit employee page, we did need one because we're editing an existing employee. And here, I'm actually going to get rid of the if statement completely. There's no loading for this one, so we're going to totally get rid of the if statement. I'm just going to press Control D to auto format the code so it's properly indented. Collapse that right there, and it looks good. All of it looks indented properly. I'm just going to get rid of this extra space, and I'm going to run it so that I can see what it looks like at this point. Once the page loads, you can hit the add employee button and we're getting an error. If you hit F12, you will be able to see what the error is. And if you look at the console, we're getting a null reference exception in the pages.addEmployee, which is add employee is just our add employee component. It doesn't really tell, see, these kind of exceptions are a little bit tricky because it doesn't tell you exactly what is the object reference exception, but I think I know what it is. Let's stop this actually. Let's go back into the page. So what we're doing here, we're binding this object. And the problem is that when you go into this page, the app service.employee object is null. So it's throwing an exception. So what we have to do here is actually bind this to an employee object that is part of this Blazor page instead of the app service. So I'm going to define a new employee object here, and I'm going to call it new employee. And I'm going to instantiate it. It has to be an object that's created. And then I'm going to go into each of my inputs where I'm doing an app bind -value and change what I'm binding to from app.employee. And what I do for this usually is I highlight what I want to replace. I press Control H, brings this up. And then I'm going to replace this value with the new value here. And then this right here, this replace button, or you can press Alt R. You see how it kind of just goes through one by one. And I like to see what it's updating, because if for some reason I don't want to replace something, I want to skip it. But in this case, we're going to replace every single one of these. And there we go. Because we don't want to pass in the employee that's set in the app service at this point. We really want to pass in a brand new one. Hit save. And we still need the app service to be injected up here at the top of the page, because if we go into the code of the create employee object, we're still calling the app service.save employee method, but then we're passing in a different object. So part of the reason why we have a save employee method with a parameter employee, if you go into here, if we were just going to use the app service.employee object every time, you technically don't need to pass a parameter in here, because you're already in the app service class and you could just access app.employee from within the scope of this method. But the reason why we pass it as a parameter is exactly for this reason, because if you want to pass in a different object instead of just the app.employee object, you're able to do that. So let's run this project. Press the start button or press F5. And when the page finally loads, you can hit the Add Employees button. And now you can see the Add Employee screen. Looks very similar to the Edit Employee screen. So one of the things that in this screen is probably not required is this created date field. So let's get rid of that. Let's go into the Blazor project. Let's go into the Add Employee Blazor page. And let's go into the HTML section. Find the created date column and just get rid of that. And hit save. And now restart the application. And we could actually test creating a brand new employee. So this should actually already work. There's really not much else that needs to be done, because we already have the web API that's created. The web API already knows how to save an employee or create one. So in this case, we're not going to pass the emp ID. And by default, the web API, if you go to it, it tries to find an employee object in this line here by emp ID. If it doesn't find one, because it's using it, we're pulling back the first item that it finds or the default. And it's not going to pull anything back. So it's be set to the default, which is null. So in this if statement, if the employee is not null, that's when it's going to take an update action. But if it is null, it's going to actually add brand new employee for us. So I'm going to leave this breakpoint here, and I'm going to run the application. And as soon as the page loads, we're going to hit the Add Employees button, and we're going to start entering a brand new employee. You can see the phone number is really huge here. We can easily fix that, and we will fix it in a second. But first, let's just test the adding capability. So here we're going to add a new person called Carla Pereira, and we're going to set that to 26 years old, and we're going to put a random fake company email, and we're going to put a random phone number in here. After we're done, it looks good. We'll hit create. You'll see that the Blazor app called, the web API that it called was the employee route. It was a HTTP post. And if you put your mouse over the employee object this here, you can see that the data that was passed into this was Carla as an email, Carla first name, and Pereira last name, and the phone numbers. It's the exact values that we had on our form. And you can see it jumped into the add action because it couldn't find an employee, using the link query here. I'm going to let it continue. Now, when it runs successfully, it should show the modal window here. But if you remember, we commented out the modal window, so we got to uncomment it out and update it as needed. So we're going to do two things next. We're going to fix this phone field so it's not huge, and we're going to add the modal window. So let's close this and stop the application. Go into the add employee component page, and let's go into the phone column. This is here, and we're just going to set this to -6. If you don't know how to use Bootstrap, if you just use column class, it'll just stretch the whole width of the row. If you do a column -1, that gives you a small column, a single column. If you do 2, it gives you 2. And if you want to know a little bit more about that, just open up your web browser and just search for Bootstrap rows and columns. And basically this here, the grid system, this is where you're gonna read this. This will explain to you how it works. Gives you detailed examples. It's pretty good. It's self-explanatory if you read through this. So I'm gonna close that. We're gonna set this to 6. And so now we have the phone number fixed, and we gotta get the modal window to pop up. So if you remember, we commented the modal window HTML code here, and you could easily uncomment this entire block of code if you highlight the whole thing. And then on your keyboard, you're gonna want to press Control K, and without letting go of the control button, press U, and that uncomments. Control K, U uncomments the code. But one of the problems you see here is that it's not properly indented. If you want it to automatically format or automatically indent, just press Control K and then D without letting go of the control button, and you can see it automatically formats the code for you. Now, if you remember this from the last video, we have this show modal Boolean variable that upon saving the employee successfully, if the return code returns 1 from the web service or the web API, we set the show modal variable to true. If you look at this is a Bootstrap modal window. So again, same thing. If you to use modal windows in HTML, you can use Bootstrap's modal window. And to do that, and you go into Bootstrap, just Google it, Bootstrap modal, like that, and it'll be the first one that pops up. Click on it, and then it'll tell you a little bit about it. This is what the modal looks like. This is what's going to be on it. Here's the snippet of code that you can use to produce this modal window, or you can hit this copy button here, and it'll copy it directly to your clipboard. That's what I did in the last video. If you didn't see it, just go back and watch the previous video. So what's happening here, if the show modal is true, this is a Blazor expression. If the show modal is true, then we're going to output this show class. This show class, we added it to the app.css file. You could have added this if you had a page-specific CSS file for add employee. You could put it in there if you want it. We're going to use this modal show class everywhere, pretty much anytime we want to show modal. So instead of adding this CSS class to every individual page, we're putting it at the application global level. So at this point, we're just going to verify the data here. We're going to change this save employee to employee created. We're going to put in the body of the modal window, it's the first name, last name, saved successfully. And we're going to add a little something here. We're going to say the new employee ID is, and we're going to output new employee.empid. And that will give us the employee ID that was just created. Now we're going to hit save. We're going to run this again. Okay, here's Carla, which we created seconds ago. So let's create add employees again, and let's add another employee. This time we're gonna create Jose Pereira, and we're gonna set age 69, and we're just gonna call it Jose at company. I'm gonna say Jose at nunosolutions.com. And we're just going to put a fake phone number, and we're ready to create this employee. We're going to hit create employee, and we should get the modal window here, but it's obviously not working. So let's go into the console window and check if we received any errors, which we didn't. So the next thing we want to make sure is the employee being created? And it is being created, as you can see here. So there's some kind of issue with our modal window. So let's go back over here, and what we're going to do is put a breakpoint on this is the line in the create employee method that actually calls the web API. I want to see what response we're getting when we actually create an employee. So now that we have a breakpoint right after we call the web service, I want to see what return code is. So let's go in here and click add employee. We're going to do Maria Pereira, and we're going to say 63, and we're going to say Maria at nunosolutions.com. And we're going to skip the phone number for this one. We're just going to create it. And what's the return code that we're getting here? We are getting a return code. So employee 9, Maria Pereira added. So we're actually getting the proper response. In fact, an even better way to do this would be to output the return message that's returned in this response into the modal window directly. Instead of us hard coding this, that was created successfully, you could actually output the response right in here. So let me just take a quick look. I'm going to let it run, and then I'm going to go back into the web page, and we still don't see it. So I'm going to hit F12 here, and I'm going to go into this little arrow button here. This is like select an element. Actually, there's a shortcut for this. If you press Control-Shift-C, and then I'm just going to click somewhere on the page because I want to pull up the HTML for this. And then I actually want to go into the modal. And what's interesting, if you look here, the modal show is not outputting for some reason. So let me go into the code. So this actually looks very much correct, this code. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to stop the application completely, and I'm going to go into the solution explorer. I'm going to right click the solution, and I'm going to click clean solution. And now I'm going to right click the solution. I'm going to say build solution to rebuild. Now I'm also going to put the breakpoint where we're setting the show modal to true. I'm going to leave the breakpoint in the if statement as well. Before we run this though, actually, I want to get the save employee response. I'm actually going to create an object here called save employee response, and I'm just going to set this to a new instantiated object so we don't get any errors. And this is basically only an empty object, not a big deal. And then instead of declaring a var here, I'm actually going to set that directly to this object. And now in the modal window, instead of outputting this over here, I'm going to delete this. I'm actually going to say at response dot return message. And this is what I was talking about. Since the API is already giving us the employee ID and the name of the employee, we could just output that directly. So now I'm going to press Control Shift and B, rebuild the application. You can see it here. That was built successfully. And now I'm going to press F5 on the keyboard, and that is going to run our application. We should see the modal window popping up. If it doesn't pop up, then there's something else going on here that we're going to figure out. And guys, in real life applications, this is exactly what ends up happening. You have to debug your code a lot of times when something's not working. So let's click add employees, and we're going to add Brianna Pereira, and we're going to say 15, and we're going to say Brianna at nunosolutions.com, and we're going to put a fake phone number in here and click create. And now let's just inspect this response object, see what it's returning. Returning the message employee 10, Brianna Pereira added. So I'm going to hit F10 to make sure it goes into the, and it is setting show modal to true, but we don't get a modal, which is very, very, very interesting actually. And if I hit F12 and I go into, and I press Control Shift and C, and I just inspect one of the elements, it is interesting though that Blazor is not updating our variable and adding the show in our modal. And I'll show you guys if that expression was working and the show was added in here. You're gonna see as soon as I add this and hit enter, it's gonna appear, as you can see here. But what's interesting here too is that the binding does not seem to be working, even the binding for the message that was returned. So it looks like the state is not being updated for some reason. So let's close this, and let me just inspect the code here in the add employee record. This is very weird because it really should update the... There's a method, guys, that you can use when you want to force the page to redraw called state has changed. Hit F12, you can see it's part of the component base component. And in Blazor, all components inherit component base class. Whenever you're inside of a Razor page or a Razor component, you always have access to this method. Let's hit save. We're gonna actually try creating one again and seeing if this save state has changed method will cause Blazor to re-render the page. You shouldn't have to do that. If you remember in the edit employee screen, we didn't have to do that. So it's kind of interesting that it's not working at this point. Click add employees again. We're gonna do Nathan Pereira. We're gonna say 13, and we're just gonna add an email, and we're gonna hit create employee. And this is interesting. So now you see we didn't get the pop-up telling us that that Nathan Pereira was added, and the employee ID is employee ID 11. I'm gonna copy the employee ID 11, hit close, go to the employee list, and now we have a list of various employees here. If I go into the SQL Server database, I could say where emp ID equals 11, and that should give us the Nathan record, which there it is. Now, whatever line your cursor is at, if you press Control C, it'll comment out that line, or you can just do dash and to do a SQL comment. And if we run this, you can see all the data that we've added so far. So we have a web application, that's a Blazor WebAssembly client application, communicating with a ASP.NET Core Web API, which is in turn communicating with a SQL Server database to update and fetch information. So let me go into the code. I'm curious about why I have to call state changed in here, and I don't have to do it in... So I do see something different here that I don't see in my other page. This method here, this create employee method, is async void, whereas this one is async task. So let's test that and see if that for some reason is why it wasn't updating. And then again, guys, I'm going to comment out the state has changed to see if this works. Again, it's very interesting to me that that one little change might be the cause of why our pop-up was not appearing. And we're going to add record here. I'm just making data up just for testing. I'm going to hit create employee. Yeah, look at that. And it worked this time. How interesting is that? So for some reason, if you create an async method, but you return void on a click event, it doesn't automatically call the state has changed method. That's very interesting. I gotta look into the Microsoft Docs to figure out why that is. Something tells me that if you create an async method, it's probably always supposed to return a task. That's probably why. But it's interesting that you don't have to return a task. You can just do void, but then manually call state has changed. That's it for this video, guys. Thanks.